Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and welcome to the Research Methods Graduate Level course. What I'd like to do in this video is go over a few of the major points from Chapter 1, Science, Society, and Criminological Research. Throughout the semester, we'll be covering a variety of topics. One of the main features that will be apparent throughout the course is how we reason about the social world and the different social scientific approaches and philosophies that we take. And then we'll also look at specific types of research methods and evaluate their strengths and their limitations. One of the first things that your authors point out in their textbook is that we have these everyday errors in reasoning: overgeneralization, selective observation, inaccurate observation, illogical reasoning, and resistance to change. And we have our research methods to try to avoid these types of errors. And we see and hear these errors constantly, whether it's in political speeches, in policymakers' recommendations, in media debates, in the courtroom, and a variety of other scenarios as well. And it's important to be able to identify those everyday errors that people make and to try to avoid those in our own work. So you can see that some of these are quite apparent and easy to identify in our society. Overgeneralization, we see that quite frequently. A lot of this we see in social media, almost that people go out of their way to make errors in reasoning. We see lots of cases of overgeneralization, of selective observation, inaccurate observation, illogical reasoning, and also resistance to change. And we'll have to address those in our presentation of research findings. That when I first started doing research back in the early 80s, I thought I could go into any scenario, any conference, any group of policymakers and say, well, I did some research and here's what I found. And they said, wow, okay, great. We're going to go ahead and make those recommended changes. Nope, didn't occur like that. I found that there's often resistance to change. If you do research and it shows that the status quo seems to be the best alternative, a lot of people say, well, yeah, that's good. See, I told you so. But if you find that there are other ways that will work better or be more cost effective, then you start getting into a lot of debates. And emotions go into this as well, certainly in some areas more than others. But I mean, you can just start. There's some areas in the research I just try not to talk about. Certainly, I would try to avoid discussions in the media due to the emotional aspects of it. And then there's some that I have no problem discussing that others would say I would never talk about that in the media. And that's where our personal aspects come into play, because certainly we have to work hard to avoid bringing our personal biases into the research process. But certainly, I would guess that there's already, kind of a bias in the sense of interests determining when we determine what we want to research. I study things I'm interested in studying. And I'm thinking that many people study certain topics because that's their passion, that's their interest, that's what they want to find out more about, that's what gets them motivated. And so, but in the same line, we know that, well, because I have that interest, do I have a certain view already? Would I hope that certain findings would take place that would lead to certain recommendations for policy changes? And I have to keep that in check. So we'll look at the social scientific research process and some of the different research methods used especially to reduce the risks of overgeneralization, inaccurate observation, and illogical reasoning. We'll also look at science versus pseudoscience and how the scientific method really is a transparent method. That if I conduct a study, and I publish that study, you should be able to read that study and pretty much know what I did, how I came to those conclusions, and you should be able to replicate that study as well. And then we can see if your findings, are similar to my findings, or if they, are different, and then start trying to figure out, what's going on when we get additional studies. We also have peer review in our research, and so we have experts in the field who read our research studies. Often the reviewers and the authors are not identified. It's a blind review, and so that tries to remove the bias of the evaluators, those that are peer reviewers, in case they know that person, and they look at the whole study and they see if there's areas that are lacking. For example, did the researcher miss some of the literature? That's very important. They look at the methodologies. They look at the sampling procedures, for example. They look at the statistical methods used, if there are stats presented, and whether or not it was the appropriate statistical procedure and if it was interpreted correctly. They look at the interpretation of the data and results. And qualitative researchers are going to look at explaining the steps that they took to gather the data, analyze the data, and then interpret the data and come to their conclusions. We're also going to look at recommendations and the whole study itself. And so that allows us to have our research reviewed by our peers. And that is very, very different than pseudoscience, which is based on intuition or just a gut feeling or personal experience. All the time. Once I had an argument with someone regarding research findings, and that person said, well, I've been doing this 20 years, and every time I've done it this way, and I found this for 20 years. I said, it's possible that you've been wrong for 20 years. And that you've been interpreting things wrong. And nevertheless, it didn't lead to any constructive resolution. But the whole idea is just because someone's been doing this or, working in a particular field for, 10 years or 20 years, doesn't necessarily mean that they have accurate observation of everything. Some of the motives for criminological research include policy, academic, and personal, and sometimes those will mix in interesting ways. And then different practices in criminological research, basically in research in general: descriptive, exploratory, explanatory, and evaluation research. And so we see that that we may conduct a study in a particular way because we want to answer certain questions, and some particular procedures are more appropriate for that. Also in your textbook, positivism, post-positivism is discussed, as well as interpretive methods and constructionism and feminist research. And some other aspects related to quantitative and qualitative research, as well as mixed methods. And then we'll look at different types of research methods, experimental approaches, surveys and questionnaires, participant observation, and intensive interviewing. And also the analysis of secondary data, whether it's analyzing data already collected for some other purpose, analyzing historical events, analyzing content, or crime mapping, and we'll evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses. And this wraps up this video. Welcome to the course.